We're on Daf Tes Zayin, and we're on the top of the Amud, and it starts with the word Gufa. That's what we got up to yesterday. So that's the third line down from the top. On Daf Tes Zayin Amud. Gufa. This was the sugi that we learned on Daf Tes Zayin Amud Aleph and on Tes Vav Amud Beis. He may Rabbi Dosa ben Hyrcanus itiru tsaras habas li'acher. In other words, they accepted the opinion of Beis Shammai that there is yibum in the case of tsaras habas. The Gemara had earlier quoted this testimony about the generation of Rabbi Dosa to prove what's called Beit Shammai Osu Kidivreim, meaning that Beit Shammai's psak that a tsaras ever falls for yibum is not just theoretical, but it was actually implemented. And that indeed is what happened during the time of Rabbi Dosa. And the situation that the Chacham faced was a very challenging one. Because on the one hand, they wanted to paskin like Beis Hillel, which means that tsaras erev does not fall for yibum. We derive that from Litzor. But on the other hand, here was Rabbi Dosa, who was matir tsaras erva, tsaras bas, la'achim. So what are they going to do? They're going to notify the people that this is not the halacha. They're going to publicize the fact that Rabbi Dosa made a mistake. This was kosher. Why? This Rabbi Dosa was no slouch. He was considered one of the great scholars of the generation. The Einov Kamu. Okay, this is something for Dr. Rich. He apparently had some sort of degeneration. He was not able to see. And because he was blind, is kamu milavo lebeis hamedrash. Kamu means they stopped allowing him, or he was not able to come to the beis hamedrash person. Now what's going to happen is they're going to iver paskin Rabbi Dosa, and he's not even present to fight with them, to argue with them, to plead his case. Amru. The Chacham said, "Mi elech v'yodiu." Somebody has to notify him that we're not going to accept his psak, which is based on the ruling of Beit Shammai, but rather we pass like Beis Hillel that tsaras erva is asur liyibum. She's an eishesah. Amru lahem. Rabbi Yeshua stands up and volunteers. Ani elech. The Achrov, after Rabbi Yeshua, me. I guess they wanted a whole entourage to go. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah went together with Rabbi Yeshua. The Achrov, after Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, me, who would go with him, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva would now go. Holchus, you have the three great Tanoim. Omdu al Pesach Peso, Nichnas Hashim Pato, the Omelo Rebbe Chachmi Yisrael Boy Netzach Omelo Yikonsu B'Nichnas. Tfaso, Rabbi Yeshua. I guess even though maybe he wasn't totally blind, Bidosa grabs onto Rabbi Yeshua. Oshivu al Mita Shel Zav Omer Lo. Rabbi Yeshua notifies Bidosa Rebbe. And Marla Talmidcha Acher. You shouldn't choose me as your Talmud and give me the Mita Shel Zav. If you are already seating me on this, this very honored place, then you should also invite other Talmidim. Now, it could be that at this point, Rabbi Dosa was not aware of who the other Talmidim were. Amalos Rabbi Dosa responds, Miu, well, who do you have in mind? Who is this other Talmud that's here? Again, it's not clear how Rabbi Dosa identified Rabbi Yeshua of all the three Tanoim, but he couldn't identify the others. Rabbi Lozman Azariah, Omar, so Rabbi Dosa says, V'yeshlo ben Lazariah Chavirenu, our friend Azariah has a son, V'kara Olav, and Rabbi Dosa quoted a pasuk in Sefer Tehillim. It says, "Hamikra zeh nara isi gam zakanti glor isi tzadik nezov zaram vakish loch." So I guess the phrase "nara ha'isi" is a reflection, a nostalgic, perhaps, reflection of Rabbi Dosa to his youth. I was a nar at the time of Azariah, and now gam zakanti, I became older. And now the son of Azariah, Rabbi Elazar, is Lora Isi Tzadik Nezor. Notice, I never saw that God would forsake his tzaddikim. And I know that Azariah was a tzaddik, and therefore his children should also be great. Now, the Maharsha here is quoted as saying that based on a Gemara in Beitza, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was very, very wealthy. The Gemara testifies that he was mafresh from his Eider 13,000 agolim annually for Meiser Behema, which is only more 10% of the calves that he owned. So he was in any event very wealthy, and therefore he could take this pasuk literally, V'zara mavakish lachem. God would not forsake his tzaddikim, in this case Azariah, and his children would be left, panhandling, knocking on doors in order to put together a loaf of bread. But at this point, after having sort of emotionally responded to the fact that one of the great scholars of the generation is none other than the son of his friend Azariah, who was a great tzaddik. Also, so Rabbi Dosa grabs onto Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Hoshiva al Mita Shel Zov, he puts him down. I don't know if it's on the same Mita Shel Zov or a different Mita Shel Zov. Amalo, so Rabbi Yeshua again turns to Rabbi Dosa, Rebbe, and Marla Talmidcha Acher v'yesh. What about the third Talmud who's here? Amalo, Mihu, who is this third Talmud? Amalo, Rabbi Yeshua says to him, Akiva ben Yosef. Amalo, Rabbi Dosa, Rabbi Akiva, Atohu Akiva ben Yosef Shimcha Holich Misofa Olav Sofa Shev B'ni Shev Kaboscha Yirbu Yisrael. Hischilu Misav Osa V'Alochos. The Chachamim started engaging Rabbi Dosa in various different halachic discussions. Ashigiu l'tzoras habas. Amru le tzoras habas ma'u. Amru lehem, Rabbi Dosa responds, Machlokas beit Shav beis Hillel, halacha k'divrei Rabbi, Amru lehem halacha k'beis Hillel. Amru le, v'alo b'shimcha amru halacha k'beit Shammai. Amru lehem, Dosa Shamata. What exactly did you hear? You heard it in the name of Dosa, O Ben Hyrcanus or Harcanus. Shamatim. What exactly did you hear? In other words, Rabbi Dosa is now investigating as to whether or not this transmission is really in his name. Amrule, they said to him, Chaye Rebbe. That's a Lashon. Stam Shaman. In other words, we didn't hear your name mentioned. We just heard that it was Ben Hyrcanus. Amalahem, Ach Katan Yeshli. In fact, I have a younger brother. B'char Satanu. Now, what does the word Satan mean here in this context? So he quotes here the Aruch Ner in the Masechet. He says, you have the Masechet, right? Charifu v'omed al dat. He is very stubborn, very sharp and stubborn. V'osa maisa al pi ma shenirah. Whatever appears to him to be right, he goes and he passes. And even if the majority disagree with him, he will not change. He's absolutely stubborn. So Rashi explains here in the footnote, you'll see, he quotes it, so I guess it means he's very sharp. Like it's like two. But what does the word satan mean? Satan al shem shaya omed al dvar. So I guess the word satan is a profound description of someone who's absolutely stubborn and unwilling to rescind his position. Yonasan Shmo. My younger brother's name is Yonasan, and he was the one who gave this ruling. And why? V'hu mitalmidei Shammai. Izaru lo yikapeach eschem b'halachos. In other words, if you're going to engage him in some sort of intellectual duel, be careful because he's very, very sharp. He actually has 300 explanations to justify the halacha like Beis Shammai that Tzaras Erev actually falls for you. Now, there's a complicated situation of him because on the one hand, Rabbi Dosa is denying that he ever said such a thing. On the contrary, he passes like Beis Hill, but on the other hand, he's warning them that his brother, by the name of Yonasan, who's very, very sharp, has 300 proofs to support the Shita Beit Shammai that Tzoras Abbas Misyabemis. So now Rabbi Dosa says the following. Aval, you should know about my brother Yonasan, that even though he has 300 answers to justify and prove that Tzoras Abbas is Misyabemis, but the halacha is not like him. Me'arini alai shamayim va'oretz, shal medocha zo yoshav chagai ad-novi, v'yomar shlosha dvarim, the first of which is Tzoras Abbas Asura. So this phrase of Yoshav al Meducha is an idiomatic phrase, and it means to, pound something, meaning to really work it through. Now, what's problematic here is how could Chagai Hanovi ask in halacha? And we have a principle called Ein Novi Rashoil Chadish Tov Me'at. So we're going to have to assume that Chagai was not only just a Novi, he was a great Talmid Chacham as well. So the first of his rulings was Tzoras Abbas Asura. Now we get to the second of the three rulings. Amon Umov Ma'asrin Maser Oni B'Shvius. Okay, now what happens over here? We're talking about Maser Oni. Now, the Shemitah cycle is divided up into three parts. The 7th year is Shemitah, so that's a section unto itself. The other two parts are years 1, 2, 4, and 5, and then years 3 and 6. In 1, 2, 4, and 5 of the Shemitah cycle, there's a Chiyuv Ma'aser Sheni, whereas in years 3 and 6, there's a Chiyuv Ma'aser Oni. In the 7th year, which is Shemitah, there's no Chiyuv Trumas Ma'aser at all. The parents are considered hefker. However, the mitzvah of Shemitah, like any mitzvah that's a Chovas Karka, is limited to Eretz Yisrael. So Trumas HaMaisros and Shemitah, all these mitzvahs of Zroim only apply in Eretz Yisrael. However, with regard to Ammon and Moav, which are what's called Artzos HaSmuchos L'Eretz, so the Rabbanan made a takana, and they required Trumas HaMaisros. So again, we don't have to worry about this in St. Louis or Washington or Brooklyn, but in those areas that are very close to Eretz Yisrael, like Syria or Babel, perhaps Mitzrayim, Ammon, and Moab, these are areas where where Noeg Trumas HaMaisros Midrabbanan. Now, there's no Chiyuv Trumas HaMaisros in Shvius in Eretz Yisrael, but yet, paradoxically, in these Artzos HaSmuchos L'Eretz Yisrael, Shemitah has the same status as any other year of the cycle. There is no Shemitah outside of the bounds of Eretz Yisrael, even in Artzos HaSmuchos. Now, during Shemitah, there's no Trumas HaMaisros in Eretz Yisrael because the Peiros are considered hefker. You have to open up your field, anyone can come in and take it. But in Chutz La'aretz, even in Artzos HaSmuchos, where we have a mitzvah Trumas HaMaisros, but we have no Shvius, and we have no mitzvah Shvius, there's no hefker to the Peiros during the 7th year. Hence, there's no P'tur in Trumas HaMaisros. So it's really interesting. We could have said, if not for Chagai and Novi, that Kol the Tikkun Rabbanan came to Raisa Tikkun, and therefore, since there's no Trumas HaMaisros in Eretz Yisrael during Shemitah, there's no Trumas HaMaisros in Chutz La'aretz, in the Artzos HaSmuchos during Shemitah. But no, we're going to go back to the reasoning behind it. If the Siba, if the cause for the P'tur of Trumas HaMaisros in Shvius applies uniquely to Eretz Yisrael and does not have any application in Chutz La'aretz, namely Hefker. Hefker is the key concept. There's no Hefker in Shana Shvius in Chutz La'aretz, hence there will be a Chiyuv in Trumas HaMaisros. And the paradox is that we're more machmir in Artzos HaSmuchos than we are in Eretz Yisrael. In the 7th year in Eretz Yisrael, there's no Trumas HaMaisros. In the 7th year in Ammon and Moav, there will be Trumas HaMaisros. Now, there's a note here in my Gemara, you have it also in yours. He says, Min Torah, Ein lanu shum makar eich ladun shmas hashmita linyan chiluk hamasros midaraisa ein ba chiyuv klal b'shum makar. So it means that if you want to give us guidelines for Trumas HaMaisros during the Shemitah year, we have no guidelines because on a Doraisa level, nowhere on the face of the earth is there a Chiyuv Trumas HaMaisros during the 7th year. And the entire entity of Trumas HaMaisros in Artzos HaSmuchos is all D'Rabbanan. El shetiknu hanavim, I'm not sure how he knows that this is a takanas hanavim. Shebe Bavel, in Artzos HaSmuchos, we divide up these lands into different subcategories. For example, in Bavel, they're going to be mafresh on the 7th year, Meiser Sheni. Again, we don't know what is the status of the 7th year. Is it Meiser Oni? Does it belong to like 1, 2, 4, and 5? Or is it Meiser Sheni belongs to 3 and 6? So here we're going to make a difference between Bavel and Mitzrayim. And then we'll get to Ammon and Moav. In the case of Bavel, we're going to require Meiser Sheni. I would apply the rule, or just for memory purposes, of Azlin and Basaruba, meaning most of the years of Shemitah, you're Chai Meiser Sheni, not Meiser On, right? 4 out of 6. So in 4 out of 6 cases, which is 66 and 2/3, whatever percentage, we're going to require in Shemitah, which is an unknown, it's a joker card, we're going to require Meiser Sheni, and that's going to happen in Bavel. However, there's another takon as far as Mitzrayim is concerned, because apparently the halacha of Trumas HaMaisros during the 7th year, or perhaps even during the first 6 years, as far as Mitzrayim is concerned, was a later takon, and that was instituted by Ezra. So the original takana was only in Bavel. A later takana at the time of Ezra was in Mitzrayim. That there's a chiv trumas and maisers in Mitzrayim. Is yafrishu ba maiser ani. Maiser ani is something that's given on the 3rd and 6th year of the Shemitah cycle. Now we're going to add another year in Mitzrayim, and during the 7th year we're going to require maiser ani. Okay, now we get to Amanu Moab. So here we have Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah and Rabbi Tarfon. This is a Mishnah Masechet Yevamot. Rabbi Tarfon holds that Amanu Moab have the same identical status as Mitzrayim, and during the 7th year in Amanu Moab we're going to be mafresh meiser on it. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah holds that we're going to give Amanu Moab the same status as Bavel, and during the Shemitah year we're going to be mafresh meiser shein. Now we go back to Chagaya Novi. Chagaya Novi Omer Shloshim Dvarim Tzor Sabas Asura. Amanu Moab Ma'asrin Meiser Ani B'Shvius, which means that we're going to accept the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, and we're going to accept an equation between Amanu Moab and Bavel. That just like in Bavel, we're mafresh meiser. I'm sorry. We're going to accept the opinion of but whose opinion was it? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was the one who said meiser shein, and Chagaya Novi is saying meiser ani. So we're accepting the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon of meiser ani. In which case, we're equating Amanu Moab with Mitzrayim. Finally, umekablin gerim min karduyin umin atarmodin. So I can't tell you much about the karduyin, but I could say a few words about the tarmodim. Tarmodim were a nation of the world. Rashi calls it Shem Uma. And the Jews lived in the area of the Tarmodim. The Tarmodim were famous, amongst other things, for supplying wood for fire. You remember that? Where is that sugya? Just testing you. It's about Hanukkah. It's in Masechet Shabbos, because the latest time to light the Ner Chanukah is when the Talmudim pack out, because they were selling, wood for your local fire. And once they packed out, people would be found in the streets. That's called Shetichle Regel Min Hashuk. Anyway, now what's the chiddush here that we can accept gerim from these two nations? It works like this. Apparently, there was a mixture of Jewish blood in these two nations. Now, you and I would say, well, that shouldn't bother us. That shouldn't inhibit us from accepting them as gerim. On the contrary, maybe that's more of a reason to accept gerim for them. I don't know. But the problem is that according to one day in the Gemara in Yevamot, which is later on, is Goy v'yevet shabal bas Yisrael avlad mams. So if, let's say, there was an admixture of Jewish blood here, then if a Jewish girl would be married to one of these guys from Kardayim or from Tarmodim, then according to one day in the Gemara, the child of such a marriage is a mam. So we don't pass like that, but you should know that there is such an opinion. Okay. So, for example, even today, we'll accept gerim who have a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father. I mean, we don't even have to be megayer them because we determine that they're Jews, but we're not going to give them the status of psulei kol. They are not mamzerim. But back in the day, there was one opinion that was very well received that if the father is a guy, the child is a mamzer. And therefore, as soon as we megayer people from these two nations, we run a very serious hashash. We have to be careful because once we accept a ger could basically marry anyone, with the exception of a Kohen, let's say. But other than Kohen, they can marry anyone, but maybe they're mamzerim because today had a mixture of mamzeros in these nations. So the Chiddush of Chagai Novi is that we're not choshesh. We're going to say that any child from these two nations that comes to the Megayer is coming from non-Jewish parents. There's no admixture of Jewish blood. They are therefore full-fledged goyim, which in this case works in their favor, because now after they gerus, they're full-fledged Jews, and there's no psul kol, there's no mamzeres, because we assume that not only was the father a goy, but the mother was a goyita. So both parents were non-Jews, and it's a clean slate as far as gerus without any psul kol. We now have a testimony of Rabbi Dosa in the name of Chagai Hanavi that we accept the shita of Beis Hillel that Tzoras Abbas Asura. Tana. This is the next part of the story about Tzoras Abbas. When the three Tanoim came in to visit Rabbi Dosa, Nichnasu b'Pesach. They all came through the same doorway. They went out of three different doorways. Now, apparently, they were really scared about this Yonasan ben Hurkins. And if one of them would engage Yonasan in a debate about the status of Tzoras Erva, then okay, if let's say this Yonasan is so sharp, he'll have 300 proofs to Beit Shammai sheep that there isn't a Figul Yibum. So one of those Tanoim would have to sort of accept, but at least admit that Yonasan has a great argument. When they leave through three different exits, then the assumption is that Yonasan ben Hyrcanus will, I guess he was there somewhere in close proximity, he would engage one of those Tanoim. And as we saw from Rabbi Dosa, he's going to attack you from all sides with 300 halachas. But there'll still be two Tanoim that he didn't encounter. So what actually happened? Yonasan beats up with Rabbi Akiva, the Akshila, and he asks him his questions, the Okra. And Rabbi Akiva tried to respond to all the arguments that were put forth by Yonasan ben Hurkins. Lo. Now Yonasan begins to recognize Ato Akiva Shishim Cholik Misofo. So follow on so far. Shrechash is a chisa l'shem. V'adayin lo igata l'roi baka. In other words, your level is a very low level. You're basically like a sheep, like a shepherd. Omelo Rabbi Akiva. Akiva was very humble. Afilu roi tzon. Yes, roi tzon are on a lower level than roi buck. Because you're talking about cattle, so you need a more sophisticated and more experienced shepherd to deal with the cattle, with the cows. But anybody could be a shepherd for little goats or shepsel. Okay, so that seems to be the end of this whole episode as recorded here Now the Gemara wants to know about the second of the three halachas Amanu Moav that were mafresh meiser oni. Amanu Moav ma'aser meiser oni b'shvius. Why? The Omar Mar harbe krachim kovshu ole Mitzrayim lo kovshu ole Bavel. We have now what's called Kedusha Rishona and Kedusha Shnia. Kedusha Rishona at the time of Yoshua, when the Ole Mitzrayim conquered the land of Eretz Yisrael. There are other lands that were settled at the time of the Aliyah Shnia, at the time of Ezra. But there were lands that had already been conquered by Ole Mitzrayim, which were not settled by Ole Bavel. And Amanu Moav will fit this description. Moshe Rabbeinu, which is called Kedusha Rishona, actually captured Sichon, if I'm not mistaken, Sichon had domination over Amanu Moav. Does it point that out over here? All right, we'll have to leave that for now. What do you say? And what happened? I think it was Sichon who captured Amanu Moav, then Moshe Rabbeinu subjugated Sichon, so therefore the status of Amanu Moav was Kedusha Rishona, which means we don't have to make any takanos of Chumas of Maisus or Shvius in Amanu Moav unless we hold a Kedusha Rishona, Kedusha L'Shayta below Kedusha. Now this area, which was conquered by Moshe, which is called Sichon, or otherwise known as Amanu Moav, was not settled at the time of the Ole Aliyah Shni of Ezra, Ole Bavel. Kedusha Rishona, Kedusha L'Shayta below Kedusha. So all those areas that were not taken into Jewish domination a second time around in the Kedusha Shniya were not sanctified. So Amanu Moav, therefore, at Sichon, would not generate a chiyuv of Chumas and Maisus. Now again, we still don't know why Amanu Moav, in the context of the Takanas Nevi'im, would be given the status of Meiser Oni, which again was what was Bavel. Did I get this right? I always get this confused here. Meiser Oni, Bavel, no, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Oh, Mitzrayim, I'm sorry, Mitzrayim. Now, V'nichum, the Ole Bavel omitted this area from Kiddush Eretz Yisrael, and what we're going to learn now is that there was a deliberate decision on the part of the Ole Bavel not to sanctify this area. They could have easily have sanctified it because Kedusha Shniya is Kitchel Shaita Vikitchel. So they had the authority, so to speak, or the potential to sanctify this area. But they deliberately decided to omit this area. So you get the impression it wasn't because they were weak, they didn't have enough Jews or enough power, to settle these areas. They made a deliberate decision and maybe even there were Jews who lived in those areas, not to sanctify that area under the law of Kedusha Shnia, Kitchel Shait, Kitchel Asabavo. And why did they make that decision? Kadeshi Yispachu Aleim Aniyim B'Shvius. If they would have sanctified that area, which is very close to the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, then now I got it. Under the law of Kitchel Shaita, the Kitchel Asidlavo, there would be a ptur of all the matanos, all matnas aniyim. And that would include even Trumas of Maisros. So in these areas, Kohanim, the Leviim, the Aniyim, would be during Shvius out in the cold. Again, you have to ask yourself a different question, because in Shvius we open up our fields. But let's assume that for some reason that wouldn't solve the problem. Again, we have to come back to that. That's a little bit of in my mind, a glitch here. But in any event, the Ole Bavel, because of the need of, let's say, the poor people to get Meiser Oni, they withheld the process of Kiddush of those areas that bordered on the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, because if they would have sanctified those areas, then Shvius no Heges, and the reason why they don't want that to happen is ein noagim babos shana during Shvius matnas aniyim shaleket shikopei meiser oni, because during Shvius all the peiros are hefker, and there's no chiyuv of matnas aniyim, no chiyuv of trumas and meisers. During Shvius, lo kitchu es hakrachim ha'elu b'kedushas Eretz Yisrael k'dei sheyizru b'hem b'Shvius. So there would be no kedushas Eretz Yisrael, there would be no Shvius, there would be no Isur of Zriya, and there would be no tour of Trumas of Meisers and other Matnas Aniyim. So now they can work the land during Shvius and produce and it's not hefker. If it's not hefker because there's no Shvius, then the chayiv and all Matnas Aniyim, including Trumas of Meisers. Now he has another element into the equation, which I'm not sure how critical this is. The askiru atzman haniyim lachrosh v'liktzar. Not only will there be matnas aniyim, but the aniyim themselves will be hired out as hired labor, which will bring them an income, because you're allowed to do charisha and ktsira. Which is really interesting on a sociological level. It sounds like what the Gemara is saying is that the more sophisticated people in society would not, what's that phrase in English? Not roll up their sleeves and get down into the mud, if you know what I mean? There's a phrase in English for that. Even today, I mean, that's so true. That's why we have our cousins here doing all this, all this work. But the Aniyim were desperate, they needed jobs, and they would hire themselves out for basic agricultural jobs. And during Shvius, they needed that parnasa, and they would get that parnasa by crossing the border beyond Eretz Yisrael. Those in Eretz Yisrael, per se, they couldn't get these jobs because there was no Charish and Zriya during Shvius. It was prohibited. But the Aniyim still had a fallback position. They could cross over the border, over the boundaries to the close areas of Artzis Asmuchas Yisrael, There was no Shvius. Because the Chachamim decided we're not going to sanctify those areas that are close to Eretz Yisrael.
Then there were also areas that we
Correct. So there was a double tartilitivusa. There were two advantages of not sanctifying the land. Number one, during Shvius, they could hide this themselves for Charish and Ketzira. Number two, they could receive Matnas Aniyim, because there's no P'tur Hefker if there's no Shvius. And the 7th year is exactly like the other 6 years. Yidei sheyu laniyim v'eretz Yisrael, me'eretz Yisrael. Mimal is panis b'shana zulo, kinshus hakrochim ha'elu v'kedushas eretz Yisrael. So the farming process would go on as usual in the 7th year. Yizru ben b'shvius yaskiru atzman aniyim lachar shv'liktzar v'yis parnasu mimatnoseyim. And also they get the matnos aniyim. Oh, now we get to the punchline. Why is it that in this area of Sichon, which is called Eretz Ammon and Moav, bordering on Eretz Yisrael, is it towards the south, if I'm not mistaken? Ammon and Moav? Not sure. Because I remember when I went down to the Dead Sea, somebody pointed and they said, "Oh, that's Eretz Moab." I don't know. I'm not sure if it was a tour guide. Talking about Aniyim, we talk about the tour guides. Anyway, so in any event, so now this whole thrust and this decision not to include Ammon and Moab in Kiddush Eretz Yisrael at the time of the Oli Bavel was in order to compassionately reach out to the Aniyim. And therefore it makes sense that during the 7th year, which is, again, as we say, it's a joker card, we don't know exactly which Meiser should be knowing in Eretz Yisrael. The one that would be chosen would be Meiser Ani, rather than Meiser Sheni, because Meiser Sheni doesn't help the Aniyim ki hu zeh. And this is the edus of Chagai Novi, that in Ammon and Moav, Ma'aser Meiser Ani b'Shvius. Again, al pi halacha, there was no pressing, if not for the compassion for the Aniyim, there was no halachic compelling reason to establish that the Meisros of Shvius in Ammon and Moav should be Meiser Ani as opposed to Meiser Sheni. There's no logical reason for that, if not for the compassion for the Aniyim, which is the very reason why in Ammon and Moav they didn't sanctify the land. Okay, we go on now to the third alam. Mekablim gerim min hakarduyim ve'hatar modim. And we're not afraid that this was a mamzer born to a Jewish mother who had a relationship with a guy. Aini, is that really so? But Tani Rabbi Rami Bar Yechezkel Ein Mekabel Geir Min HaKarduyim. We are afraid of mamzer. Over Rav Ashi Kartuyim Itmar. Meaning, according to Rami Bar Yechezkel, we have to change the gears here. We're not talking about the Karduyim, we're talking about the Kartuyim. In the case of Kartuyim, Rami Bar Yechezkel says that we're not makabel gerim from the Kartuyim. The Amri Inshi Kartuyim Psulim. So the Karduyim were considered definite goyim. meaning both mother and father are goyim, so we can be makabel gerim. But in the case of kartuyim, Rami Bar Yechezkel says that they were psulim, and people use that phrase, kartuyim psulim. There was an admixture of, I guess, a significant amount of Jewish girls in that nation, in that community. I'm thinking out loud, today, I don't have to tell you, there's a whole issue about artificial insemination, sperm donors and banks, and I don't want to go into this whole business about whether Jewish women should allow them, should become pregnant. I'm talking about women who are not married and they're getting older and eggs and this, that, the whole bit. So the question is where the sperm comes from. So I'm just thinking out loud that you don't want sperm from the kartuyim. From the karduyim, yes, but not from the kartuyim. Not from the kartuyim. Because the kartuyim had psulim. It's very interesting. We want pure Gentile blood. Sperm, I should say, right? And pure sperm of a Gentile nature has to be a kosher guy on all sides. It's counterintuitive, but that's how it is, because otherwise you can have psulei kol. You might have a sister marrying a brother. Or of Ashi, Lo, he doesn't accept this distinction between kartuyim and karduyim. Kartuye l'chud v'karduye l'chud. Wait a minute, isn't that what we just said? What does it mean lo? I don't know what the word lo means. Kartuye l'chud v'karduye l'chud. K'da'amri inshi kartuye psila. Maybe he switches it around. What did we have? We had kartuyim psula. That's exactly what he had. I see. He takes out the mem. Kartuye. Get it here. I will kartuye. I don't get it. What's the word lo? He's basically repeating what we said before. I see. I see. I skipped a line. I made a mistake. I skipped a line. This Rav Ashi is really the answer to reconcile the apparent contradiction between whether we are Makabel Gerim from this nation, where we had one brisa that says we do, and that was Chagai, and his testimony Makabel Gerim Mina Karduyim, and then we had the brisa of Rami Bar Yechezkel, and now we have the reconciliation of Rav Ashi. So I'm sorry, I just I repeated Rav Ashi, but Rav Ashi is saying that there's no contradiction between, because Yesh L'Chalek, we should differentiate between Kartuyim and Karduyim. Rabbi Yochanan, the Savia, I think, are the elders, the Amri Travayu, they both agree, Ein Makablim Geirim Min HaTarmodim. Once again, apparently there was an admixture of Jewish blood, of Jewish girls who married into the Tardomim and the Tarmodim. And now that we have a Chash of Mamzeris in the Tarmodim. So even though Chagai said Makablim Gerim Min HaKarduyim, but he didn't include Tarmodim according to this transmission. So the Gemara asks, Umi Amar Rabbi Yochanan Chachi, but tonight we have a mission in Nida. This is a mission of Ksamim. And it says, Kol HaKsamim Aboim Min HaRekem Tahorim. As we assume that Ksamim of Goyim are not Tmeim, there's no Tumas Nida. So when the Chacham said that a Kesem is considered Tameh because maybe it's now Nida, but there's no tumas nida by Nochrios, by non-Jewish women, and we're going to assume that any kesem that comes from Rekem, those ksamim belong to the Goyim, which probably means that the majority of the population of Rekem, which is, again, I think within the bounds of Eretz Yisrael, are non-Jews. Like, for example, today you go up to Natzeret, right? A lot of Natzeret are non-Jews. Just see if he adds anything here. Of Gimel, Afagav Shahoyu Bogam Yisrael. Mikol Makom Tolim Saksamim in Nachrim. Mishum She Yisrael Agarim Sham Nizharim Matzniim Es Kismeim. In other words, what he's saying is that even if the majority of the population of Rechem are Jewish, I forget, what does it say in the Mishnah Git? That you do have to say Kfonei Nechta, but you don't. Take out a Mishnah Git. Any event, so there was a significant population of Jews living in Rechem, but nevertheless, in a case of a kesem that was found, we assume it came from the Miyut Noch, because the Jewish women are more careful and they put that ksamim under lock and key. So if we found one, then we can assume it came from Noch. That's according to the Tanakh. Rabbi Yehuda Metam. Rabbi Yehuda says it's impossible to assume that a kesem that came from this area called Rechem came from the Goyim. Because you think the Goyim and Rechem are Goyim, I have news for you, he says. The Nation Gerim. They actually converted. So we don't have any Goyim living in Rechem. The so-called Goyim in Rechem are not Goyim at all. They underwent Geris. And therefore they're included under Tumas Nida. And any Xeris Chachamim regarding Samim will include even the so-called Goyim in Rechem, who are really not Goyim at all. Now, they apparently look and can be identified as Goyim. But why do you tell me they're Gerim? So the Gemara says, Toim, that although they were Gerim, eventually they went back to their old ways. And they started acting like Goyim. But technically, according to Jewish law, they're still Jewish because we're not going to revoke their Geirus retroactively. So in the case, again, of Ksavim that are found in Rechem or from Rechem, we're going to assume that even though there's a miyut of Nachrim, those Nachrim technically, according to Jewish law, are Jews. And therefore, they're included on the Nida, and the Kesem is prohibited. There may have been other places in Eretz Yisrael where they have real pedigree goyim living in Eretz Yisrael. Now, what does this have to do with the question of Kabbalas Gerim min Tarmod? So Vavinenbach, based on this Mishnah in Masechet Nida, we ask the following question here on Daf Tezayim and Beis. Kapasik Vitani, the Mishnah says that any kesem that comes with Bein Ovdei Kachavim is tar, and the Mishnah doesn't qualify it and break it down into, cases or areas that have exception, is afilu min tarmo. We can assume that this Mishnah is including any location that has Ovdei Kochav that has real goyim in it, including Tarmot. Meaning that Rekem is going to be a machlokes between the Tanakama Rabbi Yehuda, and that depends upon whether we assume that the goyim, in quotation marks, in Rekem are real goyim or they're not real goyim at all. They were actually gerim chechazru l'suram, and they were towing. That's a machlokas Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda with regard to Rekem. But in other areas where there's Ovdei Kochavim, then we assume that they are real Ovdei Kochavim. And that would seem to include even Tarmot. Because the Stam Mishnah includes all places where Ovdei Kochavim are there, and their Ksamim are therefore Tahorim, including Tarmot. Rabbi Yochanan is also Meres Mekablim Gerim Tarmot. So if the Ksamim coming from Tarmot, based on this Stam Mishnah, are Tahorim, then we can accept them as Gerim, because then we're assuming their Ksamim they are Vadei Nachrim. If they're Vadei Nachrim, there's no admixture of Jewish blood, then we can mekabel them as Gerim. So this is a stira to the original statement of Rabbi Yochanan, V'savayo de'amid shavayu ein mekabel Gerim min hatarmod. Chi tema, says the Gemara. Right, we go back to Rabbi Yochanan's statement here. Also, Meres Mekablim Gerim Tarmodim. Lo Sviril. Meaning that even though Rabbi Yochanan was medayik from the Mishnah, that the Tarmodim are absolute, complete pedigree goyim, he himself did not accept that position. Which again would have to mean that there's some of the Mishnah that maybe the case of Chagai Anovi, who said that Mekablim Gerim min hatarmodim. So even though Rabbi Yochanan was medayik from the Mishnah with regard to Ksamim, that the Ksamim coming from Tarmodim are Tahorim, therefore we can be Mekabel Gerim. But Leilo Svirila, he doesn't accept that. I'm very confused. What do you mean he doesn't accept it? How can he not accept a Mishnah? Problem gave him in a Tarmodim. And Chagai also said Mekablim gave him in a Tarmodim. And Rabbi Yochanan v'Savaya d'Amid Shavayu ein Mekablim gave him in a Tarmodim. Well, I can't rewrite the script. I mean, it says that Rabbi Yochanan holds that we're not Makabel Gerim min hatarmodim. Again, it's against the Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan himself derived this from the Mishnah. It's also against Chagai Anovi. I don't know exactly on whose shoulders Rabbi Yochanan is standing. But the Gemara rejects this passage. So Omar Rabbi Yochanan lochke Stam Mishnah. So we have now a Stam Mishnah with regard to Ksamim, that the Ksamim coming from Tarmod are ksherim, are tahorim, which means mibein ha'ovdei kochavim tahorim, and nobody disagrees with that. So and when it says mibein ovdei kochavim, we're including Tarmod. So the Gemara answers, Amoroi ninu aliba de Rabbi Yochanan. According to one opinion, Rabbi Yochanan holds you're not makabel gerim mitarmo, and we're going to have to add ein halachic kistam mishnah. Another Amora holds that Rabbi Yochanan paskins like a stam mishnah, and therefore, according to Shita, for sure, we're makabel gerim from tarmo. And now the Gemara explains what's the reasoning of those who assume that ein makabel gerim in a tarmod. Mitarmo my time lo pligi ba Rabbi Yochanan mitzavayim. Had Omar mishum avdei shlomo. Had Omar mishum bnos Yerushalayim. So according to one opinion, ein makabel gerim in a tarmod is because of avdei shlomo. So these Talmudim were served in the court of Shlomo Melech, and they got paid, I guess, a very fat salary. And then they went ahead and they married Jewish girls. They lived in Talmud. Now we have the problem that maybe the children coming from Talmud are actually Jewish mamzerim. What's Bnos Yerushalayim? Bishleim Lamandi Omer Mishum Avdei Shlomo Kosover Ove Kochav Yevet Abol Bas Yisrael Vlad Mamzer. Lamandi Omer Mishum Bnos Yerushalayim. Maihi. Why are we prohibiting Talmudim? It's Pligi Bar Rav Yosef Rabbana. Shavaya Mishmei de Rabba Bar Chon. Chad Omar Shreisar Alfei Gavri, 12,000 men. Shisa Alfe Hashtaye and 600 archers. These are the enemies of the Jewish people who conquered Yerushalayim. Chanamar Shreisar Alfe Gavre. In the same number, 12,000 men. Uminayu Shisa Alfe Kashtoi. Amongst the 12,000 men, 6,000 of them were archers. The first opinion was there was 12,000 men plus 6,000 archers. All told, 18,000. B'shoshen nitnesu ovdei kochav lehechal. When the Goyim came in to destroy the Mikdash, Hakol nifnu al kesef v'zav. Everybody pounced upon the gold and the silver. Behem, but these 12,000 Gavri and archers, nifnu al bnos Yerushalayim. Again, I don't know exactly what went on over there, but anyway, they were interested in marrying the Jewish girls. Shenemar poskin eicha. Nashim b'tzion inu b'sulos bi'arei Yehuda. And he concludes, v'gam l'shitosam nochri abol bas Yisrael v'ad bam. So v'alkein hoyu b'nei oson ha'noshim mamzerim me'achar shes yashvu b'tarmod b's'arvu ben agoyim al kein ein mekablim gerim misham sharei asurim heim lova b'kol. So just to summarize, according to the Mandi Omar, who says Mishum B'nos Yerushalayim, we have two versions. One is 12,000 plus 6, and the other is 12,000 all told. But what's common to both versions is that they married the Jewish girls. So there was an admixture of this of these enemies of the Jews that actually married into the Jewish nation. And Noshim b'tzion inu b'sulos bi'orei Yehuda. And Nochri abol bas Yisrael avlad mamzer. So the children of these Jewish girls were mamzerim, and they settled in a place called Talmud, And that's where these Jewish girls mixed together with the Goyim in Tarmod, and therefore Emakablim Gerim Misham. So the first opinion was that the admixture of these Goyim were the Avdei Shlomo. And the second opinion has it that these were the attackers who attacked the Beis HaMikdash at the time of the destruction. And there were those who were interested only in the money, in the kesef and zav, and there were those who were interested in Nashim B'Tzion, and the child of such a relationship is a mamzer. Okay, then? So this is where we're going to stop for today. Omar Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmein, on the second of the wide lines. That's where we'll pick it up in Mitzvah. Okay, then? This was more or less bordering on an Agadita, then finally we got a little halacha there towards the end.
The names are still with us. You have Kurdistan, and people talk Kurds relationship. Crete.
It's interesting because I knew a man, he's no longer alive, who said that the Italians are all Jewish.